grinding corn in old America.
Okay.
I mean, that was the woman's job. So carrying water and wood cutting was a combination of heavy labor and also, demeaning work for a man. Definitely. Well, it's like in Africa today, some people will walk 7 hours for water. The
Right.
women do that, not the men. And so back then, that was a woman's job. Yes, Peter?
No, this could be, wood cutting, could be preparation or training for being a carpenter.
I took it as they were still serving the Lord though. In essence, they were brought in
Right.
and given, and then in the end, it's almost as if they were, okay, well, we're not gonna, we're gonna show you mercy, but now you're gonna serve the Lord for the remainder of your time here. That's what your job is now. That's just how I looked at it when I was reading it.
According to the Jewish study Bible, it says that that they took the vows very seriously from Exodus chapter 20, verse 7, and Deuteronomy 5. Thus, the main theme of the chapter is the conflict between the obligation to liberate the inhabitants of the land and their oath promise to allow people to live.
That's a good insight. Good cross-reference. The question I was thinking of was question 6. One of the main reasons for God's judgment of death, this is on page 53, upon the Canaanites was to protect the Israelites from the idolatrous influences of those nations. We've been talking about it each week. What then was the problem with sparing the Gibeonites? And how was this at least partially solved in Joshua's curse upon them? Well, the curse is that you'll be woodcutters and water carriers, right?
Right.
So they were a help to the Israelites in the end, but it wasn't the ideal situation, was it? Now, one of the questions too asks, why did the Gibeonites go to such levels of deceit to get under the care of the Israelites? And I've asked Father George to read about that. That's Deuteronomy 20, 10, and 19, and then we can discuss that.
When you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it. And if it answers to you is peace and it opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you and shall serve you. But if it makes no peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall put all its males to the sword. But the women and the little ones, the cattle and everything else in the city, all its spoil, you shall take as booty for yourselves. And you shall enjoy the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. Thus you shall do to all the cities which are very far from you, which are not cities of the nations here, but in the cities of those peoples that the Lord your God gives you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and the Lord your God has commanded that they your God has, that as the Lord your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices which they have done in the service of their gods, and so to sin against the Lord your God. When you besiege the city for a long time, making war against it in order to take it, you shall not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them, for you may eat of them, but you shall not cut them down. Are the trees in the field men, or they shall be besieged by you?
Thank you. So the terms of peace would be, if you're at peace, then you become our forced laborers. But everyone else gets annihilated. But the thing is, they were not coming in here for peace. They were coming for the machine of annihilation. We know this. We talked about it. And so these folks find a way to make peace on the side by deception. And why would that be? Why would they be so desperate to get peace? Well, I think we just heard why. Israel had a reputation, and they wanted to live.
Now, is it something that in 17 they don't list the Gibeonites, they list everybody else but them?
They're part of that group.
Oh, okay, I just didn't know if they, but on purpose they left them out because they were going to be the ones that...
Right. No. They were a larger city than Ai, the one that had just
Right.
been destroyed. And so,
Looking at the map in the first chapter, and they turn south, and after they go in, so Gibeon could have been next. I don't know if they knew that, or, but,
yeah.
Right.
Also, notice the Philistines. If you're looking at the map on page 7, it says Philistines. Toward the end of our study tonight, hopefully we'll talk about this. They don't get a mention in terms of the initial campaign. Some people, well, I'll talk about it now. Some people in modern historical criticism of the Bible will say that Joshua was written much later than most scholars have thought. But the fact that the Philistines are not mentioned in these early conquests would suggest that actually it was written quite early. So we can talk about that later. Just a little point on the map. Okay, thanks, George. And John, you had mentioned the vow or the oath coming to affect Israel later in history, and we'll get to that in just a second. But does anybody want to say anything about what we just read or discussed before we move to that?
I was kind of taken by the fact that Joshua just made the decision on his own and didn't talk with the Lord. Like something lacking there.
Especially after what we talked about last week, where he made some assumptions about the city they were going to conquer, and they were wrong. Right? So
Could
he,
you argue it's original sin repeating itself, the cycle? It's there no matter who it is. Moses had his faults. Joshua had his faults. It's just a cycle. David, who we consider our honor, you know, the big oath keeper, he had somebody killed because he wanted his woman.
yes, human sin, imperfection, call it what you will, the infection of nature, it's there. And we see with Joshua, as wonderful and mighty of a warrior as he was, we're seeing his faults, which actually should be refreshing to us because it reminds us that we are all in good company with murderers, adulterers, all kinds of people who have been used greatly by God. I mean, our church is named after a person who was famous for murdering Christians, St. Paul, so God's grace prevails, all the more.
You wonder what was going on in his mind. Here's a guy, right after he entered across the Jordan, I think it was right after, the angel of the Lord, which I think a lot of people think was Christ, presented himself to him. And he fell on his face. And he said, "What do you want me to do?" He said, "I'm going to tell you what to do." And yet we see right after Jericho, he messed up with Ai, now he messed up with Gibeon. And here's a guy that had a face-to-face encounter with God. It seems to me there's a discord there.
Unless he got overconfident and figured, you know, he's on a roll, that maybe,
Maybe, yeah.
you know, doesn't need that, and then now this is kind of snapping him back, that maybe he needs a, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's also got a third of the tribes that stayed on the other side of the river because they came over to help, but they really wanted to settle over there. And I think how many battles does he want to get his group into?
Right.
Without, before more decide, oh, this is okay, we don't need to go any further. So I think that's perhaps another reason is why waste the morale and the people if you don't need to.
Good points. Okay, so let's jump ahead 250 years in Israel's history. So we're jumping way into the future here. These Gibeonites have had children, and they've had children, and they've had children. And let's see what happens to them in 2 Samuel 21, 1-6, which Lou is going to read for us. 2 Samuel 21, 1-6.
During the reign of David, there was a famine for 3 consecutive successive years. So David sought the face of the Lord. The Lord said, "It is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death." The king summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not a part of Israel, but were survivors of the Amorites. The Israelites had sworn to spare them, but Saul and his zeal for Israel and Judah had tried to annihilate it. David asked Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? How shall I make amends so that you will bless the Lord's inheritance?" The Gibeonites answered him, "We have no right to demand silver or gold from Saul or his family, nor do we have the right to put anyone in Israel to death. What do you want me to do for you?" David asked. They answered the king, "As for the man who destroyed us and plotted against us so that we have been decimated and have no place anywhere in Israel, let 7 of his male descendants be given to us to be killed and exposed before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the Lord's chosen one." So the king said, "I will give them to you."
Thank you. So that could be a whole nother Bible study on what's going on with King Saul, but basically, an oath had been sworn over these people, which is an everlasting oath in a sense. It doesn't die with one generation. So they're still there 250 years later, essentially being persecuted under King Saul. And so the oath continues to complicate things. So they're still there. Now, I'm going to jump ahead now to Nehemiah, where the Israelites have come back from captivity. They were taken into Babylon. And by the way, did you notice that the Gibeonites were part of the Amorites in that section? So that kind of goes back to your question, Ron. By the time they came back from Babylon, there's a list of the returning exiles by the number of people. And let's see, just for your own knowledge, this is Nehemiah 7, verse 25. So you've got 95 of Gibeon's descendants that make it back. But they're still there. There's still a remnant of Gibeonites within the people of God. So they're still there because an oath had been sworn over them.
It's interesting that they went into exile with the Jews. That Nebuchadnezzar said, "You guys are coming too."
They may have been carrying water and cutting wood for all we know, all those years later.
But 95.
95 people, that's it.
Wow.
So,
They probably assimilated into it like fairly recently. There was a program on the secrets of the dead, and they were talking about how they wonder what happened to the Phoenicians and so forth. And they think over time they were assimilated into the Arabs and the Jews and so forth, people that were there. And it's interesting, it's in the DNA, so I mean, there is that connection. So they probably just assimilated into the Jewish culture, like King Saul, right? Not King Saul. King Harold, right? He was into Medom, right? He was a convert to.
he was not Jewish. He was the Jewish king, but he was actually a different ethnicity.
Yeah, he technically wasn't Jewish, but he converted, right? So technically, if you're converted, at least formally, I guess you would argue he isn't.
Good. All right, any other insights, questions, thoughts on chapter 9 as we've been looking at it?
I just got a question, okay? We talk about like the New Testament, with Christ, and he's got kind of more of an opening, went beyond, a lot of Christianity went beyond the Jewish people towards the Gentiles and, kind of converting. Yet here we have back here where, I'm not saying it was under the best pretenses, but here comes a kind of a foreign people that didn't come in necessarily on a military thing, and there wasn't that same kind of, not trying to convert, but you know what I'm trying to say? I don't know.
Well, the people of God in that time had a very appealing story. If you were not on their side, you wanted to be. And many have continued to see the Jewish people that way, that as was promised in Genesis, that I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. I mean, they were to be a people set apart to show how good God is. And it continues to be the case today.
But what do you say that they weren't military though? They did come in there to destroy. They weren't. It's coming in there with flowers saying, "We love you." They were told to go and slaughter them. But I have a question. Maybe you can answer this because it does bother me. I remember in seminary it was a statement Jesus made to the Phoenician woman, the Greek woman. He kind of told her that I don't want to give crumbs to a dog. And I'm just wondering, do you think it's possible that Jesus was a little bit prejudiced too?
Well, his Jewishness is revealed in that way, but I think it was more for effect. If you're not sure what Danny's talking about, it's the section in the gospel where this woman, the Syrophoenician woman, comes to Jesus and he said, "I came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and I won't give, food to the dogs." Basically calls her a dog, and she's got so much chutzpah, as I may put it. She comes back and says, "Yes, but even the dogs get to eat the crumbs under the table," and he thinks, wow. So he was signaling that he'd come for Israel initially, but he would later come for the whole world. And she represented, I think, that bridge or that hinging point. So,
because remember too, he wouldn't meet with those Greeks, and I just wonder, you know, it just sounds like he was a person of his time too, you know, where there was that prejudice kind of, you know, because they don't convert like we do. It's interesting how he preached go convert to the masses. But wouldn't you argue though, probably to at least first maybe 100 years or something, it was probably more or less a Jewish experience, wouldn't you say? I mean, there weren't that many Gentile
Yes.
converts. Would you?
Most of the New Testament letters were written to Jewish people of the way, as they were called, before they were called Christians in Antioch, you know, people of the way. But, you know, Gentile converts were picked up along the way as well.
Could they convert back then could they fully convert? Because I know they had the believer,
Well, the big question, you may remember, that the Council of Jerusalem had to wrestle with was circumcision. Do you have to be circumcised to be a person of the way or not? And they worked through that. But I think your point is well taken, which is we must always remember the Jewishness of Jesus. Someone called him Jesus when he was reading. I like that because Yeshua and Jesus are essentially the same name. That was you? Okay, well, that was good. That was meant to be, because that was a reminder that Joshua was the forerunner of Jesus. And Jesus' Jewishness is very important. A lot of the things we do in church, it's a Jewish liturgy. The carrying of the gospel, like carrying the Torah, we talked about that. The Passover meal at the altar. But having said that, remember Paul says to the Corinthians in his second letter, I think, we no longer regard him from a human point of view. Christ in his ascension fills all in all, the whole universe. So his Jewishness historically is important, but in terms of how Christ connects with the world now, that's not as limiting or essential. He's not limited by any human categories.
I always thought that the Jews primarily were supposed to advertise God right from the beginning. And they got caught up in making rules and more rules and rules for the rules. And it made it just too complicated. It was a closed group. If they had kept it open and advertised God and made it open for everybody at the beginning, we'd all be Jews now. It was easier when people become believers. You have a choice: have a little sprinkling of water, or get circumcised. I'll take the water.
You have to think later on when the Romans, when it became more Roman, you had to literally wait, and you were baptized one time later on, and you had to do it in front of everybody. You had to confess all your sins. So I do think that people forget that too in Christianity, that we're supposed to be set aside too as Christians. But at the same time, the Jews have that cultural influence that we don't have. But at the same time, but look at our culture today, right? We're Americans, right? We're brought up here, we're so forth. We're Christians. But I hear all the time on the radio, because I'm more of a progressive than a conservative, they say you can't, either you believe in the Constitution or you believe in the Bible. And it's like we're fighting such an extreme now, whereas I don't want to fully agree with the conservatives saying that our society's anti-Christian, but I have to tell you, when I was in state school at Danbury, Westcott, they would not let me talk about God. But you could talk about Buddha, you could talk about Krishna, but I could not talk about the Judeo-Christian God.
Well, one thing is clear as we read the scriptures and have this discussion among ourselves. Human beings are broken, sinful, imperfect human beings. And only God is perfect, and only God can redeem all things. And so like when 95 Gibeonites came back after Jerusalem had been sacked and destroyed, they got to participate in the rebuilding of the wall, which was a huge privilege. And so we see that in the Bible's history, God is continually raising up a remnant, even with our sinfulness, the oaths we might make, our lack of keeping our promises. God's promises are everlasting. And so, yes, John?
I find verse 9:14 of Joshua very interesting. At least in my translation, it says, the men, not Joshua, the men of Israel sampled their provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. So there's really a corporate responsibility suggested here, that it's not just Joshua who's on the line, it's the leadership. And that's very consistent with the way the Jews operated. And they had the priests, and they had the kings, and later on. And then within the Christian church, we're required to do everything in unity. We are absolutely not a one-man or one-woman show. We're a people, the people, unity. But it just, to me, I just was reading, I said, I didn't pick that up before, but the men. So they were as much at fault as Joshua was.
Well, it's like the point that was made with Achan taking the various goodies, like the Babylonian coat and the other
Yeah.
provisions and bearing them. Someone made the point, which was a good one, well, Joshua couldn't micromanage the entire expedition and conquest. I mean, he couldn't see everything. And so, you know, he could only do so much. Listening to the Lord was the most important thing. But yes, there were other people that were at fault as well, and that's an example. Some of you manage people, correct, in your jobs? Or are you one-man shows? But it is one of the most difficult parts of leadership is management, because you can't control other people. You hope you bring good people in, but you can't always.
I had one key employee, chief engineer of a company that I ran, and he was good. He really was good. But he screwed up one time, and I came out and said, you made it, you screwed up. And he said, oh, no, I didn't do it. You know, it's all this. And what I learned is that he was unable, when he was braced with a mistake, to deal with it. So I'm not going to throw him out. He's a very valuable employee. So it modified how I approached addressing mistakes he'd made in the future.
That's a good point. How's Joshua doing with the mistakes of others, do you think, so far?
Definitely on a learning curve.
Yeah, a real steep, a real steep one.
God didn't kill him, so he did all right.
Good point.
That's good.
Well, I like the verse that follows that one you showed us, John. So Joshua established peace with them and made a treaty to let them live. And the leaders of the community swore an oath to them.
Yeah.
So he had to make the best of the situation, didn't he? 3 days after making the treaty with them, they heard that the Gibeonites were their neighbors living among them. So the Israelites set out and reached the Gibeonite cities on the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Shepharah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. But the Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the community had sworn an oath to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then the whole community grumbled against the leaders. Oh, we heard that back in Deuteronomy, didn't we? The grumbling in the wilderness for 40 years. So grumbling is part of the human condition, right?
I know you never hear grumbling.
Not in this wonderful parish, no. But I hear my colleagues talk about it.
Well, when you think about it, though, it wasn't fair in a sense because they went out in the desert. They gave up all the comforts of Egypt. Because from what I understand from reading about Egypt and the seminary course, I was thinking, they did not make it hard. I mean, I guess they were slaves, so it was harder for them. But for the most part, if you were willing to, go to their culture, kind of like America is, where you assimilate, fit in. As long as you fit in, you're fine. The Egyptians were not, and then these group of people were slaves, I guess, so they weren't treated badly. But I'm sure when they first came in, it was pretty good for them. That's why they went there. But when the new group, all they knew was a desert. So maybe when they were at that point where they had men come over to them that were saying, we want peace, maybe that's not too good to be, true not to take up to, because they were just getting the land, and here they are, about to go to war with this next group. I mean, it must have been daunting for them. They had all those different tribes that they had to fight there.
In the study Bible here, it made an interesting point. As a strategist, Joshua knew enough to talk to God before leading his troops into battle. But the peace treaties seemed innocent enough, so Joshua and the leaders made the decision of their own. So almost in our lives, the tough decisions, the big decisions, we go to God. But the lesser decisions, at least in our own minds, we rely on our own understanding, and we should be going to God for all of it. So I thought that was an interesting point.
Yeah, really.
What does Jesus mean when he says, I came not to bring peace but a sword, to divide household against household? Seems very Joshua, doesn't it? But in a spiritual sense.
But he contradicts himself later. I remember when they had the swords, and he said, we have two swords. can we do this? You know,
I mean, when
like,
they were arresting him, and he said, put your
yeah,
sword away?
Yeah, put it away, whenever Peter, one of the Gospels, Peter cuts somebody's ear off, and the other one, they're not sure who it is. I'm just saying that, like a new author just recently said that Jesus was a radical, and I don't think that's
Yeah,
necessarily
let me
true.
suggest that he wasn't contradicting himself, but perhaps he was speaking spiritually, not literally. He came not to bring peace, but a sword, not a real sword. And they may have misunderstood that and thought, okay, well, here we go, we're going to finally use our swords. But he's talking about something else. What do you think he's talking about?
In Ephesians 6, we're told what the sword is. We're to carry the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of the Lord. So, at least in Peter's context, for our purposes, the sword is basically words, and it's God's words.
And the word does divide.
Oh, yeah.
Those who believe are on one side, and those who reject it are on the
What
other.
is it, sharper than a two-edged sword? Separating what bone from sinew, something like that?
So the intention of the word is not to divide, but it does divide, and people get on the opposite side.
He wants us not to have sin in our life.
The sword is the only offensive weapon that's described in Ephesians.
Yep.
All the rest is defensive. You can attack with the word.
Yeah.
And so in that context, he talks about dividing households with the sword. So how do you think that works?
Well, some believe it, some do not. It's just the way it is. You have to choose, are you gonna live the life of God, or you're gonna live the life of, I guess, average society? Like today, our lack of accountability, you know.
Well, we've got a lot of divided households even now, where the woman comes to church and the husband stays home and refuses to cooperate and doesn't realize the advantage of having a Christian woman or a believing Jewish woman. You know, it would, guys are so unappreciative of a wife that is a believer. I'm sure it's the other way around too in some cases, where the guy is the believer and the wife is skeptical or something. But that's a divided household. And then when the parents and the kids won't respond to faith, it's you have committed parents and kids who are just fighting at every step of the way. They get confirmed because it's graduation. Now I don't have to go to church. I can stay home like Dad does. You know.
Now, you were dealing with that years and years ago, correct?
Pardon
That's
me?
been going on a long time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Forever.
Historically, the Israelites were looking for someone to lead them, though, right? At this point, against the Romans. You know, the Zealots were wanting to kill all the Romans and throw them out, were they not?
We're talking
they
about
wanted to-
Jesus?
no,
Right, was, I
Yes.
mean, I'm just trying to, you know, sometimes the imagery of the use of, you know, when Jesus says, you know, with the sword in the divided house, was he talking about the country being divided? Was the people, or, because I'm not really sure on that.
No, it was a spiritual reference, but people certainly took it literally to think that Jesus has come to liberate us from the Romans, to
Right.
bring peace on earth. In fact, when James and John said, let us sit at your right hand, they were thinking, because they'd just seen him feed the 5,000, so they thought, this is great. I want to make sure I'm like in the inner cabinet here when this guy gets on top.
Right, right.
And their mother had pushed him, right? So like, get a good job with this guy. He's going to do things.
Stay close to him.
Right, you're going to go places. And so that's what a lot of people were thinking is, hey, this is great. This is going to be here on the earth. And so they waited. They were patient. But, you know, when Jesus started to talk about the fact that the Son of Man must suffer and be crucified, Peter said, that'll never happen. And that's when he said, get thee behind me, Satan. You're on the side of man, but not of God. So all along, Jesus was trying to tell them, it's not what you think, and they couldn't hear it. And so
Right.
even at the very end, when he draws the sword, you can see the desperation to have that earthly kingdom.
When he made that final pronouncement, I think you're referring to, didn't he lose the majority of his disciples? Didn't they walk away?
The biggest exodus of people occurred when he said, my flesh is food indeed. And they said, he started saying, I'm the bread of life. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life within you. And even his own disciples said, oh, that's a hard saying. Who can understand it? And he said, do you also want to go away? Because all these people have just left the countryside because of what I just said. Do you want to go away too? And they said, Lord, to whom else can we go? You have the words of eternal life.
Right.
So that was one statement he said. And then when he began to talk about being crucified, people were shut off as well.
Yeah.
And can you blame them? I mean, put yourself in their position.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that would not be good news to me. if that's what I was thinking, that this was going to be an earthly revolution. Is anybody watching the Bible series on Sunday nights? I think it's on
Yeah.
ABC. That's very interesting. And they had a zealot last week. I didn't see last night's, but some of it's fictional, but it's based on real facts. But they had a zealot who, this was after the crucifixion of Jesus, tried to assassinate Pontius Pilate. And he ended up killing one of the Roman guards. And a lot of this is based on real history. And so what Pilate did is he said, until I find the assassin who did this, I'm going to crucify 10 Jewish young men every day. And so in the series, every day they're crucifying 10 young Jewish men. And one of them was, in the show, the nephew, I think, of Joseph of Arimathea, the Pharisee who loved Jesus so much that he gave his own tomb to him. And he came to Caiaphas, the high priest, and said, they've just crucified the person I nursed as my nephew. I mean, you've got to stop this. And so it was a real mess. It really was. And so the Zealots continued to harass the Romans for years. And they were effective fighters. And the interesting thing is, there's one scene where the Zealot confronts Peter, and Peter basically says, this is a peaceful movement. We don't want you in our camp. And he quoted the Bible and talked about, the Lord has trained my hands for war, which comes from the Psalm, and he talked about Joshua. And so you can see how a person in that mindset would say, I'm just continuing what the spirit of Joshua was all about. I'm fighting for my lands. So what a difference between different views.
I think the final blow, though, for the people that maybe were weighing in, other than the ones that saw the vision of them, was when the temple came down. That's when I think it really, because when that happened, they're saying, well, he can't be the Messiah after that. That's why I think the Messiah, you could argue in a way, is a spiritual Messiah. He wasn't just quote unquote a worldly Messiah. He was much more. And I guess for a lot of people, they can't, like they still, in the Jewish culture, I found this interesting quote. It goes, a man's about to plant a tree. And so it comes up and goes, the Messiah is here. And he goes, I'm first going to plant the tree before I go. Because I guess they had so many revolts. There's quite a few revolts, right? Up to fairly recently.
Some of you have been to Masada in the Holy Land.
Oh, yeah.
And it was one of Herod's palaces that some of the Jewish zealots gathered on top of and held the Romans back for a very long time. I can't remember the exact time, but
3 years.
3 years. They had their own
Built a
cisterns
very
of
big
water.
ramp up to that.
So the Romans thought, I mean, this is how desperate they were to get rid of these Jews. They built a ramp, which took a long time,
Yeah.
and managed to enter the fort after a very long time. But the people had all taken their lives. So the
That's a
Romans,
big pile of dirt, too.
yeah, it's huge. And so that was just one area where they were harassing the Romans. But the Romans had finally had enough, Danny, to your point. In 70 AD, they decided, we're going to destroy the temple, set it on fire, knock it down, and we're going to kill every Jew that lives, and they did. And so between the time of Jesus' crucifixion and that time, though, there had been other, what you call false messiahs. Some even had the name Jesus, trying to lead, missions of their own. But notice the only one that continued on and has now for 2,000 years is Jesus of Nazareth. And we could ask ourselves, why is that?
Well, if they only understood the scripture and about resurrection, what resurrection really means, which is in Revelation it's talked about quite clearly, it's when Jesus in the New Jerusalem comes down, and then God's going to reign on earth, and he's going to be seated in Jerusalem, and all the believers are going to be brought with him to rule the earth in peace. And that's the destiny of Christians. And it's all in the Old Testament. All John did was consolidate the Old Testament and then have, of course, the new revelation from having been brought from heaven. But they all knew this. By the time of Jesus, they all had the book, so to speak.
By the way, this is the same John that wanted to be on Jesus' right hand,
Oh, yeah.
this young fisherman. And then he ends up being the one that pens Revelation while he's exiled on the island of Patmos and talks about all these heavenly kingdom realities that are spiritual, that are for the future. So he came a long way in his own mind, didn't he? From wanting to be an earthly ruler to seeing it all spiritually.
And it's interesting that he was not only allowed to write about this, but directed to write about it. But Paul was specifically told, no, you can't. When he was caught up into heaven. So I guess maybe there was a timeliness to it all.
That's our patron saint John's referencing, St. Paul, who talks about being taken up into the third heaven. He's seen things he can't even describe, that no human being could handle. So we don't know what it was, but it sounds very powerful. This is the Paul that had blood on his hands. He'd gotten letters from the synagogue to chase Christians across the known world to kill them. He'd gotten permission. And then he ends up being a pastor.
Then he had a face-to-face encounter with Jesus.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah. So it should be great encouragement to us as we look at all these characters that God can do amazing things with anybody God chooses to do it with. Great comments.
By the way, we're gonna have to do a Bible study on like the Newer Testament, just because I need to learn about this.
We will.
Okay.
I think it was after week 2 or 3, several people came to me and said, so what are we going to do next after this? And I thought, we'll keep going. So maybe a survey of the whole Bible, or maybe a New Testament letter. We'll
Yeah,
let God
something,
show us.
yeah, because I need to catch up on this stuff, you know?
Well,
I
thank
mean,
you, and you've
you
been
know,
doing it
we
for
all do.
us.
We
Yeah,
all
no, I mean, but you guys, I mean, it's just really great to hear you all talk about this stuff, but I'm just like really, now it's like really intriguing, because I'm like, okay, I gotta go read about all of this stuff now. So I got a lot of reading to do.
It's a lot shorter than the Old Testament.
That's right. Well, we have about 8 minutes left, so rather than getting into chapter 10, the day the sun stood still, which we'll talk about next week, why don't we wrap up with a few more comments. If we look at our study guide, I'm looking at page 53. The first question is, why did the kings of 9-1 decide to fight against Israel? What military advantage did they count on? So let's go back to the beginning of chapter 9, and I'll read verse 1. When all the kings heard about Jericho and Ai, those who were west of the Jordan in the hill country, and the Judean foothills, and all along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, they formed a unified alliance to fight against Joshua and Israel.
I mean, when I first read it, I was just assuming numbers.
Yeah.
That if they, they just all combined, they would simply outman the Israelites.
Yeah, as opposed to picking them all off individually.
Right, because, if the Israelites were coming for them individually, they probably did not have the numbers to fight against them.
Yeah, back in this day, it was all about who had more numbers
Right.
in terms of, as much as
Yeah.
tactics or anything
Right.
else. So.
Well, it's true today, too.
Right.
Absolutely.
North American treaty.
Right, definitely.
All right, question 2. Why did the Gibeonites, identified as Hivites in 9:7, want to get under the protecting cover of Israel?
They saw the writing on the wall, they knew that it wasn't gonna be a good outcome for them. But it's interesting, the Hittites were war, weren't they? Or am I getting them mixed up with the Amorites? I might be getting the two mixed up, but I think this is the tribe that well not, I guess, a form of a tribe that Bathsheba came from, right? Or her husband did.
Uriah the
Yeah,
Hittite.
I think they were war. They were real militant war. So it's interesting to realize that this group, I guess they were the smart ones, realized that war is not the best outcome.
It's an interesting insight. Uriah the Hittite, coming from the Hittites. Yeah. Well, they also knew what was going to happen if they didn't figure out a way to
Right.
be clever. So it's sort of like the Syrophoenician woman who said that even the dogs get to eat the crumbs under the table. They're trying to find a way to get in right with God around the rules, you could say.
Right.
So they ended up with a subservient position, but at least that they have life.
Can't beat them, join them.
Right?
Well, they must have still liked the Jewish culture to go back with them after the Babylonian period too, right? When they went, 95 of them went back. I'm sure not all, probably some of them stayed wherever they were, but a group of them decided that they, like I say, assimilated into the Jewish culture enough to feel part of it.
And we see that continue throughout biblical history. The story of Boaz and Naomi and Ruth, that this Gentile wants to become part of the Jewish line, and she's taken care of. All right, we covered, I think, 3 and 4 in our discussion. And 5, why did the princes of Israel insist on keeping the pact that had been made with the Gibeonites? We talked about the importance of an oath, right?
Right.
Well, their lives under the law.
But also sin of pride, couldn't you argue too? That they felt that that was more important than obeying God, was they were tricked. But also in that culture, right, in the Middle Eastern culture, tricking was kind of the deal, wasn't it? Jacob did it a lot, right?
He did. His name means supplanter,
Yeah.
trickster. It's not
And they praised him
uncommon.
for it too, right?
Well, it's not uncommon in the culture today, and if you've been to Israel, you've maybe experienced this. If you go into the non-Jewish quarter, negotiations are very different than if you go to the Jewish quarter. And it's basically assumed that if you're dealing with someone who's not Arab Muslim, you don't have to be truthful to them. That's part of their culture and understanding, even in the Quran, that there's justifiable lying to an outsider. It's not to say that everybody does that, but that's just part of the culture of negotiation. So, could you turn to page 18 if you have your study guides? And I'd like us to look at the map of the various kings and their countries, or towns, whatever we want to call them, strongholds. And we have a southern and a northern campaign, which we'll look at next week. So page 18. So the Hittites, the Amalekites, the Kenites, and the Philistines are all south. Now the Philistines, remember, that's where Goliath will come from. That will fight David much later, 250 years later. So then you have the Amorites, the Jebusites, the Hivites, and the Perizzites sort of in the central location, the Canaanites along the coast, and then the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Sidonians in the north.
Were there two separate bodies of Amorites?
They were spread apart, northern and the southern. So they were one of the dominant holders of that land that would be fighting with Israel.
Which one was it you said?
The Amorites?
Oh, the Amorites,
Yeah,
yeah.
you can see what just-
Just like the Philistines are technically
Oh, yeah, right.
lowercase Greek,
Right.
they weren't technically, part of the Aegean. I guess they migrated. They were Greek somewhat. I guess like we're kind of English somewhat, but we're American.
Right, they came from Greece before it ended up in that region.
Yeah,
They carried with them a lot of the Greek traditions. Yeah. All right, well, we are close to our time. What I'd like us to do, by way of conclusion, is consider Ephesians chapter 6, to go back to Father George's point about the fact that the sword is the one weapon of aggression, the rest are for protection. And I'll pray this over all of us. This is Ephesians 6, verse 10 and following. Finally, be strengthened by the Lord and by his vast strength. Put on the full armor of God so that you can stand against the tactics of the devil. For our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the world powers of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavens. This is why you must take up the full armor of God, so that you may be able to resist in the evil day, and having prepared everything, to take your stand. Stand therefore, with truth like a belt around your waist, righteousness like armor on your chests, and your feet sandaled with readiness for the gospel of peace. In every situation take the shield of faith, and with it you will be able to extinguish the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is God's word. Spiritus Gladius. We have that in our guild room, right over our fireplace. Sword of the Spirit. That's what we call our publication.
In stone.
That's right, in stone. And there's, in fact, I give you a little quiz. Sometimes Sword Points will encourage this. Look for all those references to Spiritus Gladius around the church, the sword of the Spirit. There is one up in the church at least, and there's one in the guild room, I can tell you that. So look around, and maybe next week you can tell us where you found it. Okay? Well, let us pray. Lord, thank you for this time together as we have been equipped with the full armor that only you can give. May we be strong in your might. And just as we learned from the story of Joshua, may you do the warring for us as we show forth your glory with faith in Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so let's read up on chapter 10, the day the sun stood still. Okay. See you next week. Does anybody need a study guide?